Ema Morales never raised her voice. Not in the hospital corridors where fluorescent lights hummed above restless patients. Not in operating rooms thick with tension, and certainly not when the people around her underestimated her. Silence. She had learned long ago carried more weight than noise. That morning, the trauma wing of Harbor Ridge Medical Center was already busy when she arrived. The automatic doors sighed open, releasing the sterile scent of antiseptic and recycled air. Nurses moved quickly between rooms. Monitors beeped in steady rhythms. Stretchers rolled past with rattling urgency. Ema stepped inside, wearing clean blue scrubs and the quiet composure of someone who had seen far worse places than a hospital hallway. Her prosthetic left leg clicked softly against the polished floor as she walked. Most people didn't notice. The ones who did usually looked away too quickly. She preferred it that way. At the nurse's station, Dr. Richard Halpern was already complaining. "I don't care what the report says," the senior surgeon snapped, flipping through a chart. "If the patient coded 3 times before arrival, we stabilize first, questions later." A younger resident nodded nervously. Emma stepped behind the counter and began reviewing the overnight reports. She didn't interrupt. She didn't speak. She simply worked. After a moment, Halpern glanced up and noticed her. His eyes drifted briefly to her prosthetic leg, then back to her face. "Well," he said with a thin smile, loud enough for the residents nearby to hear, "looks like the night shift forgot to go home." A couple of interns chuckled. Emma continued reading. Halpern leaned against the desk. "You're the new transfer nurse, right?" he said. "Morales?" "Yes, doctor." Her voice was calm. Even, no defensiveness. That seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. "You worked rural clinics before this?" he asked. "Yes," he scoffed. "Well, this isn't a countryside emergency tent," he said. "Here we follow procedures." One of the interns glanced awkwardly at Emma. Another whispered something under his breath. Emma closed the chart. "I understand." Halpern studied her like he was waiting for a reaction that never came. "Good," he said finally. "Then stay in your lane." He walked off toward the trauma rooms. The residents followed him. Only the head nurse, Margaret Donnelly, remained at the desk. She gave Emma a quiet look. "Don't mind Halpern," Margaret said softly. "He's like that with everyone new." Emma nodded once. "I noticed." Margaret smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it." Emma didn't respond. Because she had already spent years working around men exactly like him. 2 hours later, the emergency pager screamed. "Trauma incoming." The doors burst open as paramedics rushed in with a patient blood-soaked the man's shirt. The trauma team assembled instantly. Halpern entered the room like a commander arriving at a battlefield. "What do we have?" he barked. Male mid-30s, a paramedic reported. Motorcycle crash. Possible internal bleeding. Ema moved beside the bed, scanning the monitors. Her eyes flicked across the vitals faster than most doctors could read them. Pulse irregular. Blood pressure dropping. Respiratory instability. Something about the pattern felt familiar. Halpern began issuing orders. Prep for surgery. Cross-match blood. Scan for spinal damage. Ema leaned closer to the patient's chest wounds. Her expression tightened slightly. Not panic. Recognition. But she said nothing, because she already knew how this conversation would go. Halpern noticed her looking. "Problem?" he asked sharply. Ema hesitated. Just half a second. "Doctor, the bleeding pattern suggests a secondary arterial rupture." Halpern frowned. "We already scanned." "Yes, but the pressure drop." "I said we scanned." The room fell silent. Residents watched nervously. Ema stepped back. "Yes, doctor." Halpern turned back to the patient. But Margaret watched Ema carefully, because the nurse's eyes hadn't changed. Not uncertainty, not embarrassment, just quiet calculation, as if she was waiting. 30 minutes later, the patient coded. Chaos erupted. Monitors screamed. Doctors scrambled. Halpern cursed under his breath. What happened, Emma didn't say a word, but Margaret noticed her glance at the surgical tray, then at the patient's chest, then back to the monitor, like someone mapping a battlefield. But again, she stayed silent. The patient survived. Barely. Halpern left the room irritated. Lucky recovery, he muttered. Emma began cleaning the station quietly. Margaret approached her. You knew something earlier, she said carefully. Emma shrugged lightly. I had a suspicion. You didn't argue. I had a suspicion. You didn't argue. Emma wiped her hands. Doctors don't like arguments. Margaret studied her. That wasn't just rural clinic experience, was it? Emma didn't answer. Instead, she rolled down her sleeve slightly. The motion briefly revealed the edge of an old scar along her forearm. Not a surgical scar, something deeper. Margaret noticed, but said nothing. Because some people carried histories you didn't ask about. That night, after a 12-hour shift that ended with more criticism than praise, Emma left the hospital alone. The sky was dark. The air smelled faintly of rain. She walked slowly down the street toward a small neighborhood bar, not to drink, just to sit somewhere quiet for a few minutes before going home. Inside, the room buzzed with low conversation and music. The bartender nodded as she entered. She sat at the counter, ordered a glass of water, and stared at the dim reflection of the room in the mirror behind the bar. Her shoulders were heavy, not with anger, just exhaustion. The bartender slid the glass toward her. Long shift, she nodded. Before she could answer, the bar door opened. Heavy boots stepped inside. Leather jackets, loud laughter, motorcycles growling outside. A group of bikers entered like they owned the place. And the moment one of them noticed the quiet nurse, sitting alone in hospital scrubs, the night began to change. The bar had the kind of noise that felt lazy rather than wild. Music hummed softly from an old speaker above the shelves. Glasses clinked against wood. Someone laughed too loudly in the back corner, then quieted when no one joined in. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear for an hour. Emma preferred places like that. She sat at the counter with both hands around a glass of water. Her scrubs were wrinkled from the long shift, the blue fabric slightly stained near the sleeve where she had leaned too close to a trauma patient earlier. The bartender, a gray-haired man named Carl, wiped the counter slowly. He had already noticed the prosthetic leg when she walked in, but he said nothing about it. People who had seen enough life learned quickly which questions didn't need answers. Hospital? He asked quietly. Emma nodded. Long day? All of them are. Carl gave a faint chuckle. That sounds about right. Outside, the low rumble of motorcycles passed on the street. Then it stopped. A moment later, the door opened. The change in the room was immediate, not dramatic, just noticeable. Heavy boots stepped inside. Leather jackets creaked as men moved across the floor. 4 bikers walked in together, talking loudly and laughing the way men do when they're used to being the loudest presence in any room. The first one to notice Emma stopped mid-sentence. Well, I'll be damned, he said, nudging the man beside him. The others followed his gaze. A woman, alone, hospital scrubs, quiet, the kind of target men like that often assumed was harmless. The tallest biker grinned and stepped toward the counter. Carl sighed under his breath. He had seen this story before. Evening, sweetheart, the biker said. Emma didn't look up. She took another slow sip of water. The biker leaned one elbow on the counter beside her. Rough day? He asked. No answer. Another biker chuckled behind him. Maybe she's shy. Emma finally lifted her eyes. They were calm, tired, and completely uninterested. I'm not interested, she said quietly. The biker smirked. That wasn't a question. Carl shifted slightly behind the bar. Maybe let the lady enjoy her drink, he said carefully. The biker ignored him. You a nurse? He asked Emma, glancing at the scrubs. Yes. Well, lucky me, he said. I've got a few injuries you could take a look at. The men behind him laughed. Emma set the glass down. Her voice stayed steady. No. The grin faded slightly. Excuse me? I said no. For a moment, the biker simply stared at her. He wasn't used to that tone. Not angry, not scared, just final. His ego reacted before his brain did. You think you're better than us or something? He asked. Emma didn't answer. Instead, she pushed the stool back slowly and stood up. The metal joint of her prosthetic leg made a faint click against the floor. The bikers noticed it immediately. One of them laughed. Well, look at that, he said. Another leaned forward. Didn't see that at first. The tall biker smirked again. So that's why you're sitting down, he said. Thought you were just tired. Emma's expression didn't change. Move. The word wasn't loud, but it landed hard. For a second, the biker looked confused, then irritated. You're telling me to move? Yes. The room had grown quiet. The other patrons had turned their heads just enough to watch without making it obvious. Carl had stopped wiping the counter. The biker stepped closer. Too close. You don't get to talk like that, he said. Emma met his gaze calmly. I just did. The man's hand shot forward suddenly. He grabbed the front of her scrub shirt and yanked. The fabric tore with a sharp ripping sound that cut through the room like a gunshot. Buttons scattered across the floor. The bar went completely silent. For a moment, no one moved, because beneath the torn fabric, something unexpected had appeared. Just below Emma's collarbone, etched in dark ink against pale skin, was a tattoo. A dagger. Sharp. Simple. Deliberate. And beneath the blade, the number 66. One of the bikers snorted. 66? He laughed. What's that supposed to be? Another leaned closer. Your body count. The men burst into loud laughter. But Emma didn't move. She didn't try to cover the tattoo. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at them and spoke. It's my kill count. The laughter died instantly, not gradually, just gone. The words hung in the air like smoke. The biker who had grabbed her shirt frowned, then scoffed. Yeah, right. But his voice sounded thinner now. Emma's eyes never left his. I stopped counting after that. No one in the room laughed this time. Carl felt the hairs on his arms stand up. Because there was something about the way she said it. Not like a threat. Not like a boast. Just a fact. One of the bikers shifted uncomfortably. Man, she's messing with you, he muttered. Yeah, another said quickly. Obviously. The tall biker forced another grin. You expect us to believe that? Emma shrugged lightly. I don't expect anything. In the back corner of the bar, an older man slowly lowered his drink. He had been watching since the moment the shirt tore. His eyes were locked on the tattoo. His expression had gone pale because he recognized it. He leaned forward slightly, staring harder. The dagger, the number, the placement. His heart began beating faster because 20 years ago, he had seen that exact mark in a classified briefing room. Only it hadn't been 66 back then. It had been 28. The old man quietly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a phone. No one noticed him dialing. At the counter, the biker still hadn't let go of Emma's shirt. Cute story, he said. Then he shoved her, not hard enough to knock her down. Just enough to make a point. The room reacted instantly. Chairs scraped. Carl stepped forward. That's enough, he snapped. The biker turned toward him. Stay out of it. But something had changed. The room no longer felt like it belonged to the bikers. The silence was heavier now, more watchful. Emma straightened slowly. Her torn scrubs hung loosely now. But she still hadn't tried to hide the tattoo. She looked at the man who shoved her. You grabbed me, she said calmly. So, you shouldn't have. The biker laughed again. But it sounded forced now. Oh yeah? What are you going to do about it? Emma didn't answer, because at that exact moment, outside the bar, a distant sound began to grow. At first it was faint, almost mistaken for wind. Then louder, rotors, helicopter blades. The sound rolled across the night sky like distant thunder. Inside the bar, people began glancing toward the windows. Carl frowned. That's strange. The bikers didn't notice yet. They were still focused on Emma. You think we're scared of a story, one of them said. Emma tilted her head slightly. No. The helicopter noise grew louder. Closer. You're not scared yet. In the corner, the old man finished his call. His voice had been quiet, but his words had been very clear. She's alive, he had said. They found her. Outside, black SUVs were already turning onto the street. And 30 minutes after a group of bikers decided to mock a quiet nurse, the men who had once fought beside her were coming back. The helicopter noise faded slowly into the distance. Inside the bar, no one spoke for several long seconds. Then the tension cracked. The tall biker laughed again, louder this time, like he needed to prove something to himself. You hear that? He said to his friends. Apparently the army's coming for Nurse Rambo. The other bikers chuckled, but it wasn't the same laughter anymore. Something about the moment had unsettled the room. Carl cleared his throat. Maybe everyone should call it a night, he said carefully. The biker ignored him again. Emma finally bent down and picked up one of the fallen buttons from the floor. Her movements were slow and deliberate, controlled. The biker leaned closer. You really think we're scared of you? He asked. Emma didn't answer. Instead, she slipped the button into her pocket and turned toward the door. Her prosthetic leg clicked quietly with each step. The bikers watched her go. One of them scoffed. Guess the war hero's done talking. Emma paused at the doorway for just a second. Then she spoke without turning around. You should leave. The biker rolled his eyes. Or what? Emma opened the door. The cool night air rushed inside. Or you'll wish you had. Then she stepped outside and disappeared into the dark street. Across town, Harbor Ridge Medical Center was preparing for another long night. The emergency room lights glowed harsh and bright. Monitors beeped. Phones rang. Paramedics rushed in and out through the sliding doors. Dr. Halpern stood near the trauma bay, reviewing paperwork with obvious irritation. This hospital needs stricter triage control, he muttered. Half these patients don't even belong in trauma. A nurse walked past carrying supplies. Margaret Donnelly approached with a clipboard. You've got another incoming case, she said. Halpern sighed. Motorcycle crash? No. She looked at the report again. Military transport. Halpern frowned. What? The ambulance siren cut through the night. Everyone in the ER turned toward the doors. Moments later, they burst open. 2 paramedics rushed inside, pushing a stretcher. But these paramedics weren't hospital staff. Their uniforms were darker. Military issue. Behind them walked 2 men in plain clothes with unmistakable posture. Special operations. The patient on the stretcher wasn't moving. Blood soaked through the bandages covering his chest. One of the paramedics shouted, "Critical trauma, gunshot wounds." The room exploded into motion. Halpern stepped forward immediately. What happened? Training accident? One of the men said. But the tone suggested that explanation was incomplete. Halpern pulled the sheet back slightly. Then his expression changed. Multiple entry wounds, he muttered, and severe internal bleeding. The patient's monitor screamed. His pulse was collapsing. Halpern turned to the staff. Prep for emergency surgery. A resident hesitated. Doctor, we don't know what kind of ammunition caused this. Halpern snapped. It doesn't matter. But the resident shook his head. Actually, it might. He pointed at the wound. The entry pattern wasn't normal. The bleeding was spreading too fast. Something inside the patient had ruptured. Halpern cursed under his breath. Get imaging now. The patient suddenly convulsed. The monitor flatlined. Code blue. The room erupted. Doctors shouted instructions. Defibrillators were prepared. The military men watched silently from the wall. Their faces were stone. Halpern barked orders. Clear! The shock jolted the patient's body. The monitor flickered, then collapsed again. Another shock. Nothing. The resident looked panicked. We're losing him. Halpern clenched his jaw. Again, but the defibrillator wouldn't fix the problem. Because the problem wasn't the heart. Something deeper had failed. Inside the ER hallway, the automatic doors opened quietly. Emma walked in. Her shift had technically ended hours earlier, but she had come back. Carl's words echoed in her head. You look like someone who doesn't go home when things get complicated. She stepped into the corridor just as the code blue alarm echoed through the hospital. Emma stopped walking. Her expression changed instantly. Not panic, focus. She followed the sound toward the trauma bay. Inside the room, chaos continued. Halpern wiped sweat from his forehead. We're losing pressure. One of the military men stepped forward. Doctor, you need to save him. Halpern snapped back. I'm trying. The patient convulsed again. The monitor screamed. Emma stepped quietly into the room. No one noticed her at first, except Margaret. Their eyes met across the chaos. Margaret's expression shifted with relief. Emma, she said. Halpern turned sharply. What is she doing here? But Emma wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the patient. Her eyes scanned the wounds, then the monitors, then the surgical tray. Something clicked in her mind instantly. She stepped closer. Halpern blocked her. This is a trauma room, nurse. I know. Then step back. Emma didn't move. Her voice stayed calm. The bleeding is internal thoracic. Halpern frowned. That's already been checked. No. She pointed at the monitor. The rhythm drop isn't cardiac. The resident glanced at the readings, then looked back at Emma. Realization spread across his face. Dr. Halpern ignored him. We don't have time for speculation. Emma looked at the patient again. Her jaw tightened because she recognized the pattern. She had seen it before. On a battlefield where seconds mattered, the monitor screamed again. Flatline. Margaret looked at Emma. Do something, she whispered. Halpern snapped. No one touches that patient until... But Emma had already moved. She grabbed a scalpel from the tray. The room froze. What are you doing? Halpern shouted. Emma didn't answer. She placed the blade against the patient's chest. The military men stepped forward instinctively. Halpern lunged toward her. You're not authorized. Emma cut. A precise incision between the ribs. Blood surged. The resident gasped. Open chest procedure. Halpern stared in disbelief. You'll kill him. But Emma's hands moved with frightening confidence. She reached inside the incision, directly into the thoracic cavity. The room watched in stunned silence, because this wasn't normal hospital medicine. This was combat surgery. Raw, fast, unforgiving. Emma located the ruptured artery. Her fingers clamped down on it. The bleeding slowed instantly. The monitor flickered. Then a heartbeat returned. Beep! Beep! The room exhaled all at once. The resident stared at the monitor in disbelief. He's back. Halpern stood frozen. You just performed a battlefield thoracotomy, he whispered. Emma finally removed her hands slowly. Her gloves were soaked in blood. She stepped back. Now you can operate. No one spoke. Because every doctor in the room understood something impossible had just happened. Emma had performed a surgical maneuver almost no civilian nurse would even know existed. And she had done it in seconds, saving the patient's life. But Halpern's face hardened. Not with gratitude. With anger. You just violated every hospital protocol we have. Emma met his eyes calmly. Yes, you're suspended immediately. The words hung in the air. Margaret stared in disbelief. Richard, Halpern cut her off. Security will escort her out. The military men looked at each other, confused. Because they had just watched her save their teammate. But the hospital rules had already spoken. Emma removed her gloves quietly. She placed them on the tray, then turned toward the door. No protest, no explanation, just calm acceptance. Behind her, the monitor continued its steady rhythm. proof that the patient was alive. 30 minutes later, black SUVs began pulling into the hospital parking lot, and the men stepping out of them were Navy SEALs. The emergency room slowly returned to a controlled rhythm. Doctors rushed the wounded man toward the operating theater. Metal doors slammed shut behind the surgical team. The steady beep of the monitor faded into the distance, but the tension Emma had left behind remained in the air like smoke. Doctor? Richard Halpern stood in the trauma bay with his arms folded, staring at the blood-stained surgical tray. His pride had been wounded far more deeply than the patient. Margaret Donnelly stepped beside him. "You know she saved him," she said quietly. Halpern didn't look at her. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" He turned sharply. "The point is, she ignored direct orders and performed an unauthorized surgical procedure in my trauma room." Margaret crossed her arms. "And if she hadn't?" Halpern hesitated. "For just a moment," the resident answered instead. "He would have died," the young doctor said. Halpern shot him a glare. "Thank you for your opinion." But the resident didn't back down. It wasn't an opinion. The room fell silent again, because everyone knew it was true. The patient had been seconds away from death, and the only person who recognized the exact injury pattern had been a nurse the hospital barely trusted. Halpern turned toward the hallway. "Where is she now?" "Security is escorting her out," Margaret said. "Good." But the word sounded hollow. Outside the hospital entrance, Emma walked quietly between two security guards. The night air had grown colder. A faint wind moved across the empty parking lot. Her torn scrubs had been replaced by a spare jacket Margaret had given her before security arrived. Neither guard spoke. They didn't need to. Emma already understood the situation. Hospitals protected hierarchy, not results. One of the guards finally cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he said quietly. "That was impressive." Emma didn't respond. They reached the front steps. Emma didn't respond. They reached the front steps. The guard opened the door. "Hospital policy requires us to escort you off the property." Emma nodded. "I understand." She stepped outside. The doors closed behind her with a soft, mechanical click. For a moment, she simply stood there. The parking lot lights buzzed softly overhead. Traffic passed somewhere in the distance. She took a slow breath, then started walking toward the street. Inside the operating room, the surgical team worked rapidly. Halpern led the procedure. But something about the surgery unsettled him. The artery repair was straightforward now. Too straightforward, because the most dangerous part of the operation had already been handled by someone he had just thrown out of the hospital. One of the surgeons finally spoke. "She clamped the artery perfectly," he said quietly. Halpern didn't respond. Another doctor nodded. If she hadn't opened the chest when she did, the sentence remained unfinished, because the outcome was obvious. Halpern tightened his jaw. Focus on the surgery. 30 minutes later, the patient's condition stabilized. The monitors settled into steady rhythms. The bleeding stopped. The surgical team stepped back. Halpern removed his gloves slowly. The operation had been successful, but the victory didn't feel like his. One of the military men waiting outside the OR approached as the doors opened. "How is he?" "He'll live," Halpern said. The man exhaled with visible relief. "Good." Then he asked a simple question. "Where's the nurse?" Halpern frowned. "What nurse?" "The one who saved him." Halpern hesitated. "That situation is being handled internally." The man's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means she violated hospital protocol." Another man stepped forward. "You're saying she's in trouble?" Halpern's voice remained cold. "She's no longer on duty." The two men exchanged a look, a long one. Then one of them spoke quietly into a small radio clipped to his jacket. "Command, this is Echo 2. Patient is stable." A pause. Then the man continued. "The medic is not on site." Another pause. Then his posture changed slightly. "Understood." He lowered the radio. What was her name? He asked. Halpern shrugged. Emma Morales. The man repeated the name slowly, then turned toward the hallway. We need to make a call? Across the city, Emma walked along a quiet street under dim streetlights. The hospital lights faded behind her. Her prosthetic leg clicked softly against the pavement. She didn't seem angry or even disappointed, just tired. The kind of tired that came from a lifetime of doing the right thing and watching it misunderstood. Her phone buzzed once. She glanced down, unknown number. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. She stopped walking, answered, "Yes?" A voice spoke from the other end. Calm, controlled. "Is this Nurse Emma Morales?" "Yes." "This is Commander Daniel Cross." She stopped moving completely. The name stirred a memory, old, sharp, dangerous. "I understand you performed emergency thoracic surgery tonight," the voice continued. "That patient is one of my men." Emma looked down the empty street. "I did what was necessary." "You were removed from the hospital afterward." "Yes." Another pause. Then the commander asked something unexpected. "What unit trained you?" Emma didn't answer, because the truth would complicate everything. Finally, she spoke. "That's not relevant anymore." The commander's voice softened slightly. "It is to me." Another pause. "Because the technique you used tonight," he stopped speaking, then finished quietly, "is taught to Navy SEAL combat medics." Emma's expression didn't change, but her eyes grew distant. "That training was a long time ago, not long enough for someone to forget it." She said nothing. Then the commander asked one final question. "Did you serve with Task Unit Iron Dagger?" The night went completely still. Cars passed somewhere far away. Wind rustled through the trees. Emma finally spoke. "That unit doesn't exist anymore." "No," the commander said. "But someone from it just saved my man's life." Another long silence passed. Then he said something that made her heart tighten. 30 minutes ago, my team started moving toward that hospital." Emma frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because when my wounded operator regained consciousness," the commander paused. "The first thing he said was a name." Emma closed her eyes briefly. "What name?" The commander answered quietly. He said, "Where's Iron Wolf?" "Ufferheader." Emma didn't breathe for several seconds. Because Iron Wolf had been her call sign, and no one had used it in years. The commander continued, "My team will be arriving shortly." Emma opened her eyes again. The street felt different now. The past had just reached out and grabbed her. "You shouldn't come," she said. But the commander's answer was immediate. "We already have." Back at Harbor Ridge Medical Center, the quiet night shattered. Black SUVs rolled into the parking lot. Doors opened. Boots hit pavement. Men in tactical jackets stepped out with controlled precision. Hospital staff stared through the windows. Confusion spread quickly because the patches on their shoulders were unmistakable. United States Navy, SEAL teams, and they were walking directly toward the hospital entrance. The sliding doors of Harbor Ridge Medical Center opened again, but this time, the people entering didn't look like ordinary visitors. 5 men stepped inside with calm, controlled precision. Their posture alone told a story the hospital staff recognized instantly. Military, not ceremonial, operational, dark jackets, quiet eyes, measured movements that suggested years of training under pressure most civilians would never understand. The receptionist stood up nervously. "Can I help you?" The man in front stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Commander Daniel Cross, Navy," he said simply, flashing an identification card. "We're here for our operator." The receptionist nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. He's in surgery recovery." Cross didn't move. "We also need to speak with a nurse." The receptionist hesitated. "Which nurse?" Cross's eyes drifted briefly across the emergency department behind her. "Emma Morales." The name rippled through the room. Two residents exchanged glances. Margaret Donnelly, standing near the trauma desk, froze. Dr. Halpern stepped out of the surgical wing just in time to hear it. Cross noticed him immediately. "You're the attending surgeon?" "Yes," Halpern said stiffly. Cross walked toward him. "I'm Commander Cross. The man you just operated on is part of my team." Halpern nodded. "He's stable." Cross studied him carefully. "We were told a nurse performed the emergency thoracic intervention that saved his life." Halpern's jaw tightened slightly. That nurse is no longer on duty. The SEAL operators behind Cross exchanged looks. Cross tilted his head. "What does that mean?" "It means she violated hospital protocol." Silence spread across the emergency department. Cross's expression didn't change, but something about his posture shifted. Almost imperceptibly, "You removed the person who saved my operator's life," he said calmly. Halpern crossed his arms. "She acted outside her authority." Cross stared at him for a moment, then asked a question. "What exactly did she do?" Halpern hesitated, then answered. "She performed a battlefield thoracotomy." One of the SEAL operators behind Cross let out a quiet breath. Another muttered something under his breath. Cross nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Halpern frowned. "You're familiar with the procedure." Cross's eyes met his. "Very." The room remained silent. Cross continued. "Only two types of people are trained to perform that procedure under pressure." Halpern didn't answer. Cross finished the sentence himself. "Combat surgeons or special operations medics." Margaret looked between them carefully. Halpern said nothing. Cross's voice grew quieter. "So I'll ask again, where is Nurse Morales?" Halpern hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the entrance. "She was escorted off hospital property." One of the SEALs stepped forward suddenly. "You threw her out." Cross raised a hand slightly. The man stepped back. But the tension remained. Margaret spoke carefully. "She left about 30 minutes ago." Cross checked his watch, then nodded slowly. "That's good." Halpern frowned. "Good?" Cross's gaze sharpened. "It means she's still close." At that exact moment, in the hospital recovery wing, the wounded operator regained consciousness. Machines peeped steadily around him. His eyes opened slowly. The nurse beside him noticed immediately. "Doctor," she said, "he's awake." Halpern and Cross both turned. Moments later, they stood beside the hospital bed. The man lying there looked exhausted but alert. His chest was heavily bandaged, but his eyes were sharp. Cross leaned forward. "Easy," he said. "You're safe." The operator blinked slowly. "Commander." "Yes." He glanced around the room, then asked a simple question. "Where is she?" Cross frowned slightly. "Who?" The operator looked confused. "The medic." Cross glanced at Halpern, then back at him. "What medic?" The man's voice was hoarse. "The one who saved me?" Halpern spoke first. "That was Nurse Morales." The operator's eyes widened slightly. "Morales?" He stared at the ceiling for a moment, thinking. Then suddenly his expression changed. Recognition. Shock. "No," he said quietly. "That's not right." Cross leaned closer. "What do you mean?" The operator looked directly at him now. "That wasn't just a nurse." The room grew completely still. "Then who was it?" Cross asked. The man swallowed slowly. "Her call sign was Iron Wolf." The words landed like a shockwave. One of the SEAL operators behind Cross whispered, "Impossible." Another shook his head. "She died years ago." But the wounded man shook his head weakly. "No, I saw the tattoo." Margaret's breath caught. "The dagger?" she asked. "Yes, number 66. Cross straightened slowly. His expression had changed, because now the pieces were finally fitting together. He turned toward Halpern. "You said she violated protocol." Halpern nodded. "Yes." Cross looked around the room, then back at him. "You just fired a Tier 1 combat medic." Halpern blinked. "What?" Cross spoke calmly. "Task Unit Iron Dagger." Call sign. Iron Wolf. Combat medic and field operator. Silence crushed the room. The residents stared in disbelief. Margaret looked stunned. Halpern's confidence began to crumble. That's not possible. Cross tilted his head slightly. You said she recognized the injury pattern immediately. Halpern didn't answer. You said she performed a thoracotomy under pressure. Still silence. Cross continued. And you said she saved my operator's life? Halpern swallowed. Yes. Cross nodded once. Then I'd say it's very possible. One of the younger doctors whispered, "How many operations did she serve in?" Cross looked toward the window for a moment, then answered quietly, "Enough that most of them are still classified." Another resident asked softly, "Then why was she working here?" Cross turned back toward them. Because sometimes the people who see the worst parts of war decide the only way forward is to save lives instead of taking them. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. Not confusion, respect. Margaret looked toward the hospital entrance. She said she was just a nurse. Cross gave a faint smile. That sounds like her. Halpern looked pale now. You're telling me I removed a decorated special operations medic from my hospital. Cross corrected him gently. No! You removed the person who saved your patient's life. Halpern said nothing. Cross turned toward the SEAL operators. Find her. The men nodded immediately, because they already knew one thing. Emma Morales wasn't just a nurse. She was someone they had once trusted with their lives. And tonight, she had saved another one. Emma had almost reached the bus stop 2 blocks from the hospital when the first black SUV turned the corner. She noticed it immediately, not because it was loud, but because it was too quiet. The vehicle slowed as it approached the curb. Headlights washed across the pavement and stopped just short of her feet. Emma didn't run. Running had never solved anything. Instead, she turned slowly to face the vehicle. The passenger door opened. Commander Daniel Cross stepped out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them. Cars passing, distant sirens echoing. The quiet rhythm of ordinary life continuing without any idea what had just happened inside the hospital behind them. Cross studied her carefully. The torn scrubs had been covered by a borrowed jacket. Her posture was calm, but the exhaustion in her eyes was impossible to miss. You walk away fast, he said. Emma looked at the streetlights. I've had practice. Cross nodded slightly. I imagine you have. Another SUV pulled up behind his. 2 SEAL operators stepped out but remained a respectful distance away. None of them reached for weapons. None of them spoke. They were waiting. Because the conversation belonged to the 2 people standing in the street. Cross stepped closer. My operator is alive, he said. I know. He asked for you. Emma's expression didn't change. That's not necessary. Cross tilted his head. You saved his life. That was my job. You don't work for us anymore. She looked at him directly. Saving lives is still my job. The simplicity of the answer caught him off guard. For a moment, the commander said nothing. Then he glanced toward the hospital building rising above the rooftops in the distance. They removed you from duty, he said. Yes. They're about to regret that. Emma shook her head slightly. That's not why I helped him. I know. Cross studied her again. You could have stayed hidden. Probably. Then why come back? Emma took a slow breath. The cool night air moved across the street. Because someone needed help. That was the entire explanation. Cross exhaled quietly. Some things don't change. No, she said softly. They don't. At Harbor Ridge Medical Center, the atmosphere had transformed completely. Hospital administrators had been called in. Phones rang. Whispers spread through the corridors. The presence of Navy SEAL operators in the emergency department had made sure of that. Dr. Halpern stood inside the conference room facing the hospital director. You removed the nurse who saved a special operations soldier, the director asked slowly. Halpern shifted uncomfortably. She violated protocol, the director finished. Yes. The director leaned back in his chair, and now a SEAL commander is asking why our hospital punished the person who prevented a combat casualty. Halpern said nothing. Margaret Donnelly stood quietly against the wall. She watched the conversation unfold without interruption, because she already knew how it would end. The director rubbed his temples. "Do you know how many medical lawsuits involve failure to act?" he asked. Halpern remained silent. "Do you know how many involve saving someone's life too quickly?" Halpern swallowed. The answer was obvious. None. The director sighed. "Find her." Outside the hospital, Cross and Emma were still standing beside the SUV. One of the operators approached. "Sir," Cross turned. "Report. We confirmed with the hospital. And they're trying to locate her." Cross glanced back at Emma. "That won't be necessary." The operator nodded and stepped back. Emma folded her arms lightly. "I assume the patient will recover." Cross nodded. "He will." "Good." She started to turn away. Cross stopped her. "Emma." She paused. "You saved another SEAL tonight?" "Yes." "That makes 3." She looked back at him. "I stopped counting." Cross's eyes drifted briefly toward her collarbone. Even beneath the jacket, he knew exactly where the tattoo rested. The dagger, the number. 66, he said quietly. Emma's expression hardened slightly. Old math, Cross nodded, but accurate. The street grew quiet again. Finally, he asked the question he had been holding since the moment he heard her name. Why disappear? Emma looked up at the dark sky. Because sometimes surviving isn't the same as living. The answer carried more weight than any long explanation could have. Cross understood immediately. War left scars that medals never showed. And some of those scars only healed when people stepped away from the battlefield entirely. "You could train," he said, "teach combat medicine." Emma shook her head. "I already do." Cross frowned slightly. "You work in a civilian hospital." "Exactly." He thought about that for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Fair point." Inside the hospital recovery room, the wounded SEAL rested quietly. The monitors beeped steadily beside him. Margaret entered the room slowly. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I got shot." She smiled slightly. That would explain it. He looked toward the door. "Did she come back?" Margaret hesitated. "No." The SEAL nodded slowly. "That sounds like her. You know her well." He stared at the ceiling. "I trusted her with my life once." Margaret looked at the steady monitor beside the bed. "And tonight?" The SEAL smiled faintly. "Looks like I still do." Outside, the conversation between Emma and Commander Cross was ending. Cross stepped back toward the SUV. "My team will stay until our operator is transported," he said. Emma nodded. "Take care of him." "We will?" She turned and started walking down the street again. Cross watched her go. "Emma." She stopped once more. "Yes. The door's always open if you ever want to come back." She considered that for a moment, then gave a small shake of her head. "I already found where I belong." Cross didn't argue, because sometimes the strongest soldiers weren't the ones still fighting. Sometimes they were the ones who chose a different battlefield. Emma continued down the quiet sidewalk. Just another nurse walking home after a long shift. No one passing by would ever know what had happened that night. No one would see the scars she carried, or the lives she had saved. But somewhere inside Harbor Ridge Medical Center, a Navy SEAL was alive because of her. And sometimes that was enough. Stories like Emma's rarely make headlines. They don't come with medals or parades. They live quietly in hospital corridors, emergency rooms, and the hands of people who refuse to stand still when someone's life hangs in the balance. Because real heroes don't always look like soldiers. Sometimes they look like nurses. Sometimes they walk with a prosthetic leg. And sometimes the only evidence of the battles they've fought is a small tattoo hidden beneath a uniform. So if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that courage often hides in plain sight, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment what you would have done.